In part 2 of Workshop 1, we'll take a closer look at entering formulas and functions. We'll review a little bit of formatting as well. If you have access to this video, you should have access to a file called Gradebook, and that's the one we're going to be working in for this part of Workshop 1. This is a workbook titled Gradebook, and it's a sample workbook that someone might be able to use and reconfigure for their own gradebook worksheet. I've got two tabs in here that I'm using, grades and attendance, and there's also an extra tab in here, and we didn't review this in part 1, but every workbook opens up with a default of 3 worksheets. They're named sheet 1, sheet 2, and sheet 3. Well, I have renamed 2 of those sheets, and you can do that by right-clicking on the sheet tab name and changing the name. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to change the name of both of these. I'll right-click on 501 attendance, click rename, and actually I'm just going to remove the 501 off of the front. And I'll do the same thing for 501 grades and edit that by highlighting it and pressing the delete key. And then I'm just going to take a look at sheet 1. There's nothing on it, so I have decided I don't want to use it. So I'm going to right click on sheet 1 and delete it. Now it brings us back into the attendance sheet, and in column A I've got names of students and dates across the top. Notice the formatting of these dates with this counter or this clockwise rotation that we have on them here. We're going to do something similar in the grades worksheet. So if you take a look at the grades sheet, right now all of these columns are really too narrow to be read. So I'd like to select from B1 through P1. We're going to use the Format Cells dialog box like we did in part 1 to change the orientation of these headings here, and that's going to help us see them a little bit better. We're going to have to adjust the column widths also, but this changing the orientation will help. Now there's a dialog box launcher button on the alignment group on the home tab, just like there was on the number group. So if we click that, we'll get that Format Cells dialog box just like we had before. Instead of number being in the front, alignment is now in the front. And there's some other things that we can do. For instance, we can wrap the text, and we can also use this orientation handle to change the orientation. I'm just going to rotate it up by 45 degrees. I could also have typed in a number of degrees that I wanted to rotate. And then when I click OK, I'll see that change. Now these are a lot more readable. If you needed to change the column width, you could highlight the entire column starting with B and going over to P, and let's just say we want to drag them out just a little bit so that they're a little bit more readable. And so now all of those columns are the same width since we selected them and changed their width at the same time. We've got some other headings here in columns Q through U that we'll do the same thing with. We'll select them, and this time we can use, instead of using the Format Cells, let's just choose this generic orientation button, and it will automatically angle counterclockwise or clockwise, or even 180 degrees up or down, based on what we choose here. So let's choose the angle counterclockwise, and that's basically the same thing we did with the other things. And so we'll leave it at that. Now let's choose all of these from U all the way back over to B, and even including A1, and let's make them bold. So that sets them apart just a little bit more. And we'll also bold the students' names. Select that range and click the bold on the Home tab. Now you're going to notice that the values in each row represent the grades that that particular student got on the assignments. Right now, I am calculating, and we'll take a look at this a little bit later. I'm calculating a letter grade based on the total number of points. And everyone's showing an F because everyone's total is right now a 0. So we've got to do something about that. We want to total up everybody's points, and then we want to divide that total by the total number of points that they can get. That's just one way of calculating a percentage that I use in my classes. So what we can do, let's practice one other thing. Let's delete row 9. So select row 9, right click on it and choose delete. And let's change the format of these points possible. These are just the total points possible. We'll select that value. Let's change the color to, say, green, and we'll make it bold, and maybe just a little bit bigger. And that way we know that we're dealing with a different set of numbers. These are the actual total possible points for a student, for any student in the class. You'll also notice I've got one, and this is, again, this is just kind of a personal technique that I use to calculate my grades. When I've got something that's considered a bonus, I do not include it in the total possible points, but I do add those numbers into the student's grades, and so in effect I'm giving them the points that they earn on that bonus over and above what they could ordinarily earn. So that's how that works. So in the total, we'll click first of all on Mr. Tomcat's total in row 2. And what we want to do in here is create a calculation that will add up all the values from B2 through P2. There are many, many ways of doing this, but the most basic way of doing it is to enter a manual formula. Formulas and functions in Excel always begin with an equal sign. So if you're doing a calculation, you must start it with an equal sign. And if you are typing it manually, if you're doing a manual formula, you have to actually key in that equal sign from the keyboard. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select the equal sign on my keyboard, and then again I'm doing this one manually, so I'm going to I can either type in the cell name that I want to include in the formula, or I can click on it. The clicking on it is going to be a lot easier. So I'll click on B2, and then I want to add B2 to C2, and I'm inserting a plus sign as I go along. Now I'm going to start typing D2 plus E2 plus F2 plus G2 plus H2, and I'm going to go all the way through P. J, K, L, M2, N2, O2, and P2. So this is just like me plugging this into a calculator where I'm adding all those values. Notice as I typed or pointed and clicked on those cells, each one was color-coded, so Excel is telling you that it's keeping track of what you're putting in that formula. Now I'm just going to, and also notice that it shows up in the formula bar here. Now I'm just going to click the Enter button here, and I'll finish that off. So Tomcat's total is 204. So let's do something different for Scooby-Doo. Down in Q3, and you'll notice this is a lot easier, we will type in a sum function. And so again, we'll start by typing in an equal sign, and every predefined function inside of Excel has a special keyword that identifies what it does. And in the case of a sum function, it's the keyword SUM for sum. And so we'll just type that in. Notice that Excel already, it's pulling up the functions that start with SUM, and so it's ready to help us with it. Every function after the keyword, the next character would be in open parentheses, so that you can tell Excel what values you want to work with. These are the arguments for the function. And you'll see that the format is saying it has to be a series of numbers that we're adding in. We could separate those numbers by commas, but remember the range format that we looked at earlier that gave us a beginning cell, a colon in the middle, and an ending cell. That is what we want to use, and we can actually use the mouse to do that. For this one, let's start with B3 and drag over, and notice that the function is filling out as we go along all the way over to P3, and we will close with a closing parentheses and press the enter key. So that gives us the sum function. Alrighty. There's still an easier way of doing this. You'll notice on this home tab in the editing group there's a button called the auto sum. That's one place we're going to find this button that will automatically insert a sum function for us. But remember, on the formulas tab we also have the option to use automatic functions and formulas, and notice there's an auto sum button here as well. More than likely you're going to be using the auto sum button on the home tab the most, so let's just do that. We will click right on the auto sum, and notice how it formats a sum function for us with the correct range. It has actually guessed that we want to sum the values in B4 through P4, and it's correct. So we can hit the enter key. Alrighty, now we could go along and put that sum function in various ways, but I want you to also practice what you learned before in part 1. Let's go back up to Q4 and use our fill handle. Place your mouse on that lower right corner, and we're going to copy this formula down, or copy this function down, and it should copy correctly. Every cell now, Q5 is going to be the sum of B5 through P5. Q6 will be the sum of B6 through P6, and so on. So now we've got totals that represent the actual totals of all of our students. And if we make a change or a correction, those totals will also reflect that change. Let's pause a moment before we go on to talk a little bit about the order in which mathematical expressions are calculated. I'm going to add a sheet here and zoom up just a bit. You'll notice in your handout that you have an expression called "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally," and you may remember that if you took a math class or if you've done some studying in math. It's something to help you remember the order of mathematical operations. And I'll write it like this, just to help us remember what this means. Please comes first, and that is representative of parentheses being the first in the priority of calculations. Then exponents, or exponentiation, then multiplication and division, and really at the same level. Let me spell that correctly. And then finally addition and subtraction. So what does that mean? And we'll just do a little sample here. If I put in a formula of just numbers, I won't reference any cells, but if I put in a formula that where I'm maybe saying 5 plus 3 times 2, and here everything should be familiar, possibly the asterisk is something new, but that is the multiplication symbol. So this is just a mathematical expression saying 5 plus 3 times 2. Well, if I read that, or if I calculated that from left to right, I would calculate 5 plus 3 is 8 times 2 is 16. But that is not mathematically correct. I'm going to hit the enter key, and Excel will tell us what the correct evaluation of this expression is. It's not 16, it's 11. And the reason for that is that the 3 times 2, the multiplication, was calculated before adding on the 5. So what Excel did was to say 3 times 2 is 6, and then it added on the 5 to get 11. And this is exactly what happens in any type of mathematical expression, in any kind of algebraic expression. Now, if my intention was to actually add the 5 and the 3 first, I've got to override the normal order of operation by putting parentheses around the 5 plus 3. And that is why parentheses comes first in the order. So I'll update this by putting parentheses around the 5 plus 3, and that will make Excel know that 5 plus 3 is to be evaluated before multiplying. And now what we'll have is 5 plus 3 equals 8, and then we'll multiply by 2, and then we'll get 16. So in most cases, you're already going to understand what calculations you need to make and how your order of expressions is going to work. But it's really important to just remember that it can make a big difference. It was a difference between 11 and 16. So if you're calculating a payment or some kind of fee, you want to make sure that you've got everything in the order that it should be expressed correctly. Okay, so let's go back to our grades sheet. And now we'll take a look, again, I'll zoom up just a bit. We'll take a look at our students' final grade percentage is what this column is referencing. Now again, these are calculations that I do. This is not anything that has to be done for grading or anything that is an absolute. This is just a way that I calculate grades. An example where I take the total number of points that a student has earned and I divide it by the total possible points, in this case 710, and that gives me the percentage of the total points that that student earned. And so I'll put that into, I'll put the first one into cell R2. Again, starting with an equal sign, I'll simply click on the total here. This student has earned a total of 204 points, and the division sign is the /, and then I will click on the 710 to say that I'm going to divide this student's total points by the total possible points, and I can go ahead and hit the enter key. And of course the student has a in decimal format that is 29%. We will we'll go back and reformat that a little bit differently, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. Let's go back to that formula again. Q2 divided by Q9. That means that I'm dividing, again, the total of the student's points, dividing it by 710. Well, I want to do that for everyone. And on first thought, maybe what I can do is just copy that formula down. An error is going to happen. I'll just prepare you for that when we copy it, and then we'll go back and explain why the error happened. But I'll use my fill handle to copy that formula down. Alrighty, so let's spread this out a little bit. The error that is happening is a divide by zero error. And let's see why that's happening. If I take a look at cell R3, I am dividing Q3, which is the student's total points of 655, by Q10. Well, Q10, I wanted to divide by Q9, correct? The 710. But since I used my autofill, my formula is copying down in increments. And so since I went down one row, that Q9 became Q10. And we're going to find the same thing in all of the other formulas. Q4 is correct because, yes, I wanted to move down a row for the total, but Q11, if I look at it, doesn't have anything in it. So I've got to find a way of dividing each of these totals by the same Q9 and not having it change when I copy it, or else I'll have to key it in every single time, which is not desirable. So let me go back to R2 and we'll talk about how to do that. Q9, again, is both Q2 and Q9 are called relative references. That means when I copy them from column to column or row to row, they change in relative sequence. But I want that to happen for Q2 because I want to be dividing Q3, Q4, Q5, and so on. But I don't want that to happen to Q9. So what I need to do is change Q9 to what's called an absolute reference. Whereas when I copy this formula, it's going to stay Q9 no matter what. And this is an instance that you'll find in a lot of cases when you're multiplying by a rate or some value that needs to be the absolute value that you're using in a calculation, no matter where the other parts of the formula are coming from. So in order to do that, Excel recognizes an absolute reference by inserting dollar signs before the column and the row. So I'll click before the Q, the column reference, type in a dollar sign, and I'll click before the 9 and insert a dollar sign there, and click my enter button. And this time when I copy down, I get valid calculations here. And again, if I go back and look, that's because I'm dividing Q3 by Q9. And here, I'm dividing Q4 by Q9, and so forth. So now we've got the final grade percentages calculated. But there's still something wrong. Why do all students show an F? Well, let's take a look at the formula. Let's take a look at the formula in S2 that shows what's being done to calculate this F here in column S. Okay. What we've got here, and I won't attempt to explain the entire function here, but basically what's happening here is we're using a logical function to check to see if this value in R2 passes a certain threshold to make a letter grade. So it's checking to see, first of all, if the grade is less than 60, starts off as an F. So that's why we've got the F here. It's definitely less than 60. If it is not less than 60, meaning it's 61 or above, it checks to see if it's between 61 and 70, and we would get a D, and so on. If it is out of the D range, we check to see if it's in the C range, and we would get a C. Well, there's something very fundamentally wrong here, that I'm checking these whole numbers. I'm checking 60, 70, 80, multiples of 10, and the number that I'm checking is a decimal value, so I'll never actually get a correct evaluation based on the numbers that I've got here. So what I do, and again, this is something that I go through or that I add to my formulas, is to adjust this number to kind of make it look like a normal grade that I would see, that you would see in a grade report or on a paper. I can look at these numbers and know what the percentages are: 28.7%, 92.9%, 97.9% in my head, but Excel has to have them in that format to be able to work with them in the calculation. So I can very simply make those adjustments. For each of my numbers here, if I multiply it by 100, I kind of normalize it into a grade percentage. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll just go into the formula bar here and multiply by 100. That's going to make that 0.287 equal to 27.7. And I'll do that one more time, and then we'll copy it down. You can do it as many times as you would like to practice. Then once you're ready, find the last one that you updated, use your fill handle to copy it down. So now our letter grades are looking more normal. Of course, this person with the 28.7 still has an F, but now the person with the 92.25 has an A. This person has an A. Here's a B range. All the 80s are B's, the 70s would be C's, and so forth. Now we've also got a little readability problem where we've got this long string of decimals after this number. Another thing that I like to do is to limit my decimal places, and I want to round up to whole numbers. So I am going to highlight all of these numbers and take a look at the formatting on the Home tab for numbers. There are two buttons here, increase decimal and decrease decimal. Well, what I want to do is decrease decimal. So I'm going to click this decrease decimal, and notice how the numbers, one at a time, the decimals are being rounded out of there. And that is exactly what's happening. They're being rounded. So notice this 72.96, what it will result in. It will be rounded to the 73. So now I've got values that look a little bit more like grades. And I've just done that with a manual formula. So we looked at this very complicated if statement before, where it is checking multiple tiers of numbers to assign the letter grades A, B, C, D, or F. Like I said, we're not going to talk about that, but you do have the copy of this in your workbook. What we want to do is a little bit more simple logical function that might be a way to understand how these work. This pass-fail flag is going to check to see if the final grade percentage is above a threshold, and if it is above that threshold, we'll put in a value of pass in that cell, and if it doesn't meet that threshold, we'll get a value of fail. And that's what the logical if statement does. It checks your condition. You put in a condition, and if that condition is true, it does one thing. If the condition is false, it does something else. So again, just like any other formula or function, we start with an equal sign, and the key word for the if statement is simply if, if, and it actually, Excel already knows what we're getting ready to do. It tells us that this function checks whether a condition is met and returns one value if true and another value if false. Again, just like the other functions, we start off with an open parentheses, and here we have the format of the function. We put our logical test in, and then we put the value, what we want to show up if that logical test is true, and after a comma, we put a value in if that logical test is false. So our logical test is just going to be, we will check the value in R to see if it is greater than, and we're just going to put a shift period, that's the greater than sign, see if it's greater than, let's say 59. So there's our logical test. We have a comma after the logical test, and the value, if true, should be a, it has to be in quotes because we want Excel to know that we're not trying to put a special keyword or anything in there, because it'll give us an error message if it doesn't recognize it. If we put in quotes, it knows that we just want it to display the value that's in quotes. So we put in the quotes, and if that logical test is true, we're going to put the word pass, and we close the quotes, and we put a comma, and then the value if false. And that will be the word fail. And then finally we need to close our parentheses. And so our logical test, or our logical if statement, says if R2 is greater than 59, we're going to put the word pass in our column. If not, we'll put the word fail. So let's click the enter box. And of course, since this value is not greater than 59, it should show up as fail. When I copy this down, I'm assuming that these next folks are all pass, so that, because all of those values are greater than 60. So that's a simple logical statement. This could be used to check inventory. If a certain level is low, put in a flag that says time to order. In checking a student's registration, if they've Another way I see this being used is maybe checking to see if all items that were requested have been received, and if so, you put a yes or no or something like that. Lots of different applications for something like this. Now this is a logical function. Most of the time we're going to be using numeric functions or mathematical functions, and so we've got some practice in here for that. You'll see these boxes here, average, minimum, maximum. What this is intended to be is a just to keep track of the tests, these basic statistics about the different tests that the students have taken. So if I scroll up, I'll see that I have some information for test 1 in column G here. In column J, I have information for test 2. And I have test 3 in column N, and test 4 in column P. So my statistics are going to come from those columns. And again, just like the sum and the if, the basic format of a function is the same. So if I click in cell G11, and I think I've merged these two cells together, so that's why they look kind of funny. They're spanning across two columns, but I have merged those two cells. But in that cell, I will put in the equal sign, and I'm just going to type the word average because I know that Excel knows if I type that in what I'm meaning. My open parentheses, and then I believe I said in column G were my statistics for the test 1. So I'm going to use my mouse now to select the range of test grades in column G. So my function is being built here, the average of G2 to G8. And I will close my parentheses and hit the enter key. So the average is calculated as 71.28. You know, we could reduce the decimal places if we wanted to. We won't do that right now. Let's do another way. Of course, we could manually enter all of these functions, but just to give you some practice of different ways of entering these functions, let's take a look at that auto sum button again on the home tab. Make sure that you're in G12. Click the arrow on the auto sum button, and there's some basic functions, very often used functions that show up in this list, and we could also look at even more functions, but we want the minimum function, so that's showing up already in the list. So I'm going to click on min, and already Excel has started to build this function. Well, it's not exactly correct because I want to do the minimum value of that same range, the range of tests, and it's only showing me one cell. So with this cell selected, I can go back through that range, it's in G, and drag over that range of cells, and my range again is G2 to G8. So the minimum test grade in that range is a 0, which is very true because Tomcat got a 0 on that test. Probably didn't take it. For maximum, let's do something else. We could go back to that same auto sum button, but just to show you that it shows up in other places, take a look at our insert function button next to the formula bar. We can click that, and we can either use the categories that show up by default, or we can go to a particular set of categories. I'll try math and trig and see if max shows up in there. It doesn't. It is a statistical function. So let's take a look at the list here. There's the max. So I could choose max there. It's a statistical function, so we find it in that list. And when we click OK, Excel actually gives us, if we didn't know how to build it manually like we've been doing the other ones, it gives us a format for building it. So the max, the arguments are the numbers here. And right now, again, it's guessing G11 and G12, which is part of, no, it's not even part of our range here. We want the same range that we've been selecting before. So we can actually either use the keyboard to type that in, or again use the mouse to select it, G2 to G8. And number 2 is there in case we need it, but since we've put our entire range inside of number 1, we'll click OK. And so we've got the maximum test grade on that test was 96. So you can practice getting the average, minimum, and maximum on test 2, test 3, and test 4. We'll just do that. I'll do test 2 really quickly. First of all, let me show you how I merged these cells, similar to the way I merged the cells for test 1, F and G. I'm going to take K and L and merge them, select them, click merge and center, and those two cells are merged into one. And now I'll type in test 2. And then again, I'll do these formulas in a slightly different way. Now I just did all three of those functions without saying anything, just to show the different ways of doing them. You should do the same thing for tests 3 and 4 and try different ways of doing it and just choose what you like the best. After you use these for a long time, you probably will find that you're going to be using the same functions all of the time, and so you probably will just key them in manually, because that's generally the quickest way of doing it once you're used to using certain functions.